Down South Hunting Podcast. This is Mike Higmond, and I have a special guest host with us today. I've got Parker and MacDonald on the phone with me. Welcome to the show, Parker.
Hey, Mike. Thanks for having me on the show, man. Hope you're ready for an awesome conversation. I'm looking forward to this.
Heck yeah, man. Yeah. So Parker is the host of the Southern Ground Hunting Podcast and also YouTube channel. What else are you guys up to?
Right now, man, just shooting small bucks is pretty much.
Yeah.
What
Well, you got one in Kentucky, right?
Yeah. And I shot one in Kentucky a couple weeks ago, and we put that video up, and then I took a shot at one in Tennessee on Saturday on opening day.
Oh, nice.
And I kind of got to. It was one of those situations where I'd never been on this public piece before. I'd never scouted it, never done anything. I went in early in the morning in the dark, and this little buck showed up about 9 o'clock. A bigger buck showed up like right at daylight before I could see my pins, and then a smaller one showed up, and I was like, man, it'd be so cool to shoot a deer my first time stepping foot in here. And I took a shot, dude, and I missed it by like a foot at 18 yards. I have no idea what happened. It was pretty bad, but that video will be up pretty soon.
That's probably one of those limb that you couldn't see, I'm sure.
It was flying pretty dang straight. It just flew straight into an oak tree, hit it square. I still don't know what happened, man. Like, I know I didn't get bumped because I checked it afterwards and it was fine, but I think it was God's way of telling me that I need to stop shooting at small bucks.
Yeah.
So
it was a blessing of a miss.
Yeah. As he was running away and blowing and stuff, I was like, I'm not even really that mad about that. I shouldn't have taken that shot anyways.
Well, and you've had Adam Cruz, who, used to be on the podcast. I'm sure most people listening know that. So he's been doing some video for you too, right?
Yeah. He started doing Adam started doing video, and then his camera arm broke like the first day in Kentucky, so he didn't actually get to do any Kentucky video, but he did get to go on the early season Tennessee hunt, the velvet hunt, and he's going to be doing some video and putting it on the channel as well. So, man, Adam's a good dude. I love Adam.
Yeah, we were chatting, and he mentioned that you got a buck and sent us a picture of it, and obviously it wasn't huge, but he said you'd been
it wasn't huge.
He said you've been like hunting really hard, and and actually I've watched the videos since then with all that poison ivy and stuff you're dealing with. It was like that buck presented you with an opportunity to leave guilt free.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean that was really
my tag's full. I can't hunt anymore. I got to go home. Yeah,
I got to go home. Like I slept in a couple days and stuff. Like I was just so like done. My face was swollen up in Kentucky. If somebody's watching this or listening to this and hasn't seen the video, go watch the video and you'll probably understand.
I'll get so jacked up for like an out of town hunt, but I'll tell you, like after like 3 days of being away from home, a lot of times it's like, man, I'm about done. Then of course the next weekend I'd be ready to go again. But
yeah,
it's those people do week-long hunts. That's serious, man.
It's hardcore. I didn't ever think I'd be that way. I always thought like, no, if I get a chance to go out of state to go hunt, I'm going to be all about it. I'm going to leave the wife and kids here. They'll be fine. I'm not going to worry about them. No, dude, that ain't the case, man. Like I get out there and I'm like, man, I just miss my babies, and it's so weird. I never thought I'd be that way, but here I am being that way. Yeah, that's pretty much what I've been doing.
Cool.
Trying to hunt as much as I can. Alabama opens in a few weeks, and getting ready for that. That's about it.
I went hunting last weekend. It was the opening of the public area that I was hunting on. I did a lot. I hung a lot of trail cameras. I did a ton of walking. I got real sore from hunting in my saddle for the first time in a year. But that's about it. I didn't really do much for like seeing deer or anything like that. So
yeah, which is probably the story of most Florida guys. They did a lot of walking, and that was about it.
It was really hot. Yeah,
and it was hot.
Right? Yeah.
Yep. However, dude, I don't know if you follow Chasing Tails, Walter Lee, and those guys, but Chase killed a freaking giant
It's the second one of the year, man. That guy's making it happen.
Second one.
Yep.
Like a 12-pointer on Florida public land. That is
might have to have him come on here and talk about that. Yeah, find out.
Man.
I got to find out where he's hunting. So maybe if I have him as guest on the podcast, he'll tell me.
Yeah,
I'm not sure.
Yeah, that guy's a beast. I told Walter, I was like, man, he puts the chase back in chasing tails.
Yep.
So
we just got done talking to Craig Harper, which was I really enjoyed talking to him. Dr. Harper is an expert when it comes to habitat management and biology, and he's also really into deer hunting, heavily involved with the QDMA, so he does a really good job of relating all of that sciencey stuff to deer hunting. So I really enjoyed it. So we just got done talking to him. The podcast went a little different direction than I originally planned. I was hoping to just kind of go over like a bunch of individual species that we should be scouting for, basically. But what it turned into is like more of an overall habitat picture. I think what we ended up though was with a really good blend of what private landowners can do to manage habitat versus people that don't have as much control can just look at what they've got for habitat and know what they're dealing with. You got any thoughts on how it went?
Man, I thought it went great. I thought he was, like you said, it was an excellent balance of, things that a private land guy versus a public land guy can look for and maybe do to improve their chances of success. Man, I know I learned a ton. It was just awesome.
Yeah, I think so because Dr. Harper for a living, like his job is to help people improve he works for the state of Tennessee, helping landowners improve their habitat, whether it be really big or really small or whatever. So whenever we talk about anything, he can't help but just tell us how people can make it better. But what I was really glad is we were able to get in some stuff about how, if you just lease some land or something like that, it's not necessarily, you got to plant huge food plots or whatever. He's got some advice for some little things. So I think there's something in there for everybody.
Yep. I feel the same way, man. It was excellent. I'm excited about it.
All right. So before we jump into the interview, is there anything else that we should be keeping an eye out for Southern Ground coming up?
Yeah. So I'm actually recording a podcast today that is called "Should Parker Stop Shooting Small Bucks?" So it's going to be a really funny podcast, I think. I feel like I've been having kind of a just one of those life-changing moments in my hunting career where I'm like, okay, maybe I should start waiting. It's just really hard, man. As a guy who hunts Alabama public land, sometimes you're not going to see a buck. Like, yeah, I know you can relate to that with hunting Florida, and so you have to really be an opportunist more than anything. And I have found myself kind of like, should I stop? Like, should I keep doing it? I don't know. So I'm going to be working through that, and it's going to be all in video form and podcast form, so everybody will get to hear about it.
All right. Well, I'm just going to give you my thoughts, even though you didn't ask for them.
Yeah, let's hear them.
Okay. I think this year, probably not. It sounds like you've kind of like scratched the itch for the year and maybe step your game up a little bit. But I can tell you, like for myself this year, last year I did not get a single deer, and I have been buying beef from the store, which is like,
oh no.
Yeah, it's horrible. And I can't believe how expensive beef is.
Yeah.
I haven't been eating steaks, because of how expensive they are. It's so nice having venison. So I can tell you now, Florida has implemented antler restrictions now, so I can't just shoot whatever spike I want. But I can tell you right now, if it's legal, I'm shooting it because I want some venison.
Yep.
But that doesn't mean like for all time I'm always going to just shoot whatever's legal. It just depends on where you're at. Whatever gets you excited at the moment. And right now, backstrap gets me pretty excited.
Dude, it doesn't matter what kind either, as long as they don't have spots.
Right.
A lot of the time, man, I'm all about it. So that's what I'm trying to work my way through how I actually feel about it. I have no issue with somebody who shoots small deer because I do that. I'm just trying to figure out for myself, is it something I want to keep doing or maybe I want to hold off? So we'll see. We'll see where it goes. It could go either way.
And I'm not looking to mow down every brown is down, shoot every spike in the woods either, but
Exactly.
whatever makes you happy at the moment. As long as it's not detrimental to uh, the habitat and conservation in general. You don't want to kill every
Yep.
doe out there just because you want to kill. But I don't even think we
Exactly.
need to say that. Most people are serious enough to listen to podcasts and do this kind of stuff, or take that stuff pretty seriously. So
Yeah, definitely.
cool, man. Well, let's get Dr. Harper on the line. Even though we already talked to him, we're speaking in future terms because the people we're talking to right now have not heard him yet. So let's do that.
Let's do it.
All right, I'm really excited to have Dr. Craig Harper with us. He is a professor of wildlife management, and he's an extension wildlife specialist with the University of Tennessee. And he also is just launched a new book called Wildlife Food Plots and Early Successional Plants. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Harper.
Hey guys, how are you doing?
I'm doing real good. I'm excited to talk to you today.
Well, me too. Good to be with you. Good to sit down and talk about things that we're interested in and having to do with either managing deer or managing habitat for deer. And I just poured a cup of coffee, so I'm
All
good
right.
to go.
Excellent.
Well, I know from hearing you speak at the QDMA conventions that you are a virtual encyclopedia of plants and handling food plots and all that kind of stuff. But I wanted to do something a little bit different with you today, although we're going to cover that a little bit, is I want to talk to you about a lot of natural browse and how we as hunters in the South should relate to our habitat with us. So I think probably the best place to start, this is pretty elementary, but could you kind of just give us like a rundown of how deer eat and relate to food?
Oh, well. Deer are classified as concentrate selectors. They're not actually browsers like a goat is, and they're not grazers like cattle are. They're not intermediate feeders like an elk would be classified. But if you went way to the left side and put grazers over there, then come to the right a little ways, and there would be intermediate feeders, and then come to the right a little ways further, and you would have the concentrate selectors, and then all the way over on the right then would be the browsers. And a concentrate selector is one that concentrates its feeding on specific plants and specific plant parts, and that's not difficult to understand in that we all recognize that there are some plants that deer readily eat, if they are available, obviously, and there are plants that they don't readily eat. And their selectivity, of course, is always based on what's available to them. And if various things are not available to them, they're going to have to eat what is available. And so within any area, there will be some plants that might show up as being eaten more than they would be, or eaten less than they would be in other areas. It's based on what is available to them. That's number one. Then number two, of course, deer would, and they select the most tender and nutritious parts of the plant. And that almost always are the leaves and the ends of the twigs out at the ends of the plants, because that's the youngest portions of the plants. And so there is less cell wall constituents, there's less lignin in those portions of the plants, which means there is more digestible energy and more digestible nutrients in those portions of the plants, and we assume that they taste better. So there are some plants deer like better than others, and regardless of which plants it is that they're eating, they're going to try and select the most tender and nutritious portions of the plant.
I like the way that you explain that. I think that kind of reminds me to mention this. So as an extension, I don't know, are you still an extension agent? But basically your job is to connect the research community with the with the average Joe, basically to take all the science information you've got and put that into something that's digestible for the average guy. Does that seem like a good summary?
In a nutshell, that's true. Actually across each state, there is a network of extension offices, and there are extension agents who work in those offices. And the extension agents work with the clientele in their counties. So homeowners, landowners, and it could be somebody that's just interested in fertilizing their lawn. It could be, of course, a soybean producer. It could be a landowner who has problems with bats in their attic, or someone who has problems working out tax issues. And so there are agents in the county who help with all these different kinds of things. You know, extension is not just agriculture. There's a whole segment of what's called family and consumer sciences that extension agents help with. And there are extension agents in the counties where the largest metropolitan cities are, just like there are agents in counties that are very rural. And so each of those agents, of course, have a background, and they are more specialized in some areas and things than other areas. And so you wouldn't ask a family and an agent who concentrates in family and consumer sciences anything to do with getting rid of insects that are attacking your clover plot or eating up your wheat or soybeans. And so if those agents are not able to answer the questions or help the clientele with issues that they are faced with, then they call the specialist. And the specialists are housed at the land-grant universities in those states. And each state has one or more land-grant universities. And, of course, there are specialists in all types of areas. I'm the wildlife specialist here in Tennessee. Most states, not all, but almost all of them have an extension wildlife specialist. And just like the extension agents, we wildlife specialists, we specialize in different facets related to wildlife management. And so the area that I specialize in is applied habitat management, and particularly as related to game species. So I then take information that has been learned through science-based research, and we extend that to the agents in the counties, as well as to state and federal agencies, whether it's the State Wildlife Agency or, U.S. Forest Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, etc. We help extend that information to both lay and professional audiences. And if there are topics that I feel need to be researched that research faculty are not addressing, I, and oftentimes use the word we, do that research ourselves, we being myself and my graduate students. And so since coming to the University of Tennessee in 1998, I have been involved in research, and all of the research that I do is directly married to my extension program, because the research that I do is specifically about things that we then can give to professional wildlife managers or private lands wildlife managers to help them manage both lands and populations to help suit their objectives. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that actually puts into context how, the whole virtual encyclopedia thing, why you need to know all these different plants and chemicals and how to treat this and all these different situations, because basically you're the guy they call if they don't know the answer.
A lot of them do, yes. And I don't have all the answers. No one has all the answers, but our job is to help people find the answer. So that's what we try to do.
Awesome. Okay.
Now, if I can get back to the original question, we just made a big loop, it seems like. But you asked about plants that deer eat. I explained that they like to eat some, and they don't like some others as much, and whatever it is that they eat, they try to eat the parts that are youngest and most palatable and most nutritious. If we break those down, in general, deer will select forbs when they are available over other plant types. And forbs are simply those broadleafed herbaceous plants, as opposed to grasses or sedges or rushes, or brambles such as blackberry, raspberry, dewberry, woody vines, shrubs, and trees. So there's lots of different types of plants, let's call it. And at the top of the list with regard to selectivity, if they are available, and preference, if virtually everything is available, Forbs is number one. Now, they don't eat all Forbs equally. There are some species of Forbs that they would select over others. But in general, those are the plants that have the greatest nutritional value, especially spring through summer, when the nutritional demand by deer, whether it's does with fawns, lactating and producing lots of milk for fawn growth, or if it's bucks growing antlers, or deer in general just growing and putting on skeletal growth, body mass, etc. So Forbs is number one in terms of selectivity and the nutritional content. There are different types of Forbs, just like several other kinds of plants. There are annual Forbs and perennial Forbs. Annual Forbs grow, produce seed, and die, and have to come back from seed. Perennial Forbs will come back from the root system, just like perennial grasses would. And of course, all the shrubs and trees, of course, are perennial. You know, they don't die. They just enter senescence during a particular time of year, and then they leaf back out. So those are all perennial. In general, there probably are more annual Forbs that deer would select than perennial Forbs. But there's lots of perennial Forbs that they strongly select and are very high quality. But keep that in mind with regard to how it might influence your management, because what you would do to stimulate or maintain an annual plant community, let's say in an old field, for example, is different from what you would do to perpetuate or maintain a perennial Forb community in an old field. So you would take the food preferences and food quality that of deer and for deer, and you use that information to help guide your management to provide the highest quality and the highest quantity of food available, especially during that spring through, let's say, midsummer period when the nutritional demand is greatest by deer.
Dr. Harper, my question would be on, you're talking about Forbs, and I've noticed a lot of the same thing, you know, especially in the last, I don't know, probably month or so. I've been hunting a lot of early season out of state hunts, and noticing that a lot of those areas outside of, let's say, a soybean field or a corn field where Forbs are more abundant, I guess, that the deer are almost always choosing that area before they go into a feeding area that we would probably all, as a hunter, I would have called like a soybean field a destination food source type thing. But they're almost always hitting those Forbs beforehand. Could you give an example for maybe the average guy who is hearing you talk about Forbs and doesn't really know necessarily what they're looking for or even what they are? Could you give an example of what some of the Forbs that would be more prevalent in the South would be?
Yeah, and some of the ones that everybody would identify or at least recognize if they saw it is common ragweed. Common ragweed is prevalent throughout the South into the Northeast and, of course, Midwest. It is certainly a plant that is selected by deer more strongly in some areas than others, but always at least a medium quality selected plant. Pokeweed is another that is usually strongly selected by deer, but always at least medium selectivity and greater. Others, such as daisy fleabane and old field aster, Even common lamb's quarters you will see eaten commonly. There's many of those, and most of the ones that we commonly recognize are typically just called weeds, because they grow without planting, and they're available in the seed bank, and they pop up especially after some type of soil disturbance, such as disking, or if you're planting crops, whether you're drilling or using conventional tillage, there's some soil disturbance. And so you will see these plants popping up. We call them ruderal weeds a lot of times. Mm-hmm. Now, what's unfortunate is that, for example, I can show a picture of a field that has all these, quote, weeds growing in it, and there will be a segment of your audience that kind of just rolls their eyes and says, "Oh my gosh, that's just a field full of weeds. That's not good for anything." Well, I understand that initial impulse, but what I tell folks is take just a minute and look closely at what you're seeing, because it's not just a green swath in front of you. There's actually thousands, if not millions, of plants out across, this field. And if you look closely, you'll start seeing which ones deer are eating and to the extent of which that they are eating. And once you start looking at this from a plant by plant basis, you'll see, wow, they actually are eating in here a lot. And you just made the observation, they eat those plants as they're entering a soybean field. Well, I'm not going to say that they like some of those plants better, equal, whatever to soybeans. Many of them they do. I know that because we've measured it even within soybean food plots. However, think about where deer are coming from. They're usually coming from cover that is located outside of the soybean field. And so as they approach the field, have you ever watched deer as they're walking along? I mean, unless they're alerted, and unless, a buck is chasing a doe during the rut, for example, they are almost always kind of searching around and nibbling on things. Mm-hmm. That's what they do. They're almost all, if they're up, they're almost always feeding, kind of nibbling on things. Now, if they're in the woods, a lot of times they're not nibbling much at all, because there's not much available to them in most woods. And so once they get to the edge of the field where there's more sunlight coming in, you have more plant growth. And so plants, of course, require sunlight, water, and nutrients in order to grow. And if any one of those three is lacking for a majority of plants, you're going to see limited growth. And so once they get into an area where sunlight is not limiting, you have more plant growth coming up, and there's more to choose from. And so it's just natural, as a deer walks out into a field, all of a sudden, here's a whole bunch of food available. It's similar if we go into some room where there's a banquet, and there's tables full of food, and we're all walking around and socializing. Well, you're picking up things as you go along. Oh, there's some of that, and there's some of that. I haven't had any of that. And you're just eating along as you go. So that's what you're seeing when you watch deer come into a field. Now, there's lots of things that we could discuss related to that. Which ones of those plants are the deer selecting? And which ones are they not eating at all? And so if we identify that, we then can get rid of those plants that the deer don't like, or the ones that are not providing anything for deer. And if we do that, then by default, more space is made available for those plants that deer do like. And they will fill in those spaces naturally. You don't have to plant them. And it can be of a whole bunch of different species, not just one or two species. And so that then also is buffering the amount of grazing that is taking place on your food plots. And, hopefully you're choosing your food plots, what you're planting in a food plot, based on the nutritional demands of deer and the times of the year that the needed nutrition of the deer is limiting on your property. And each property is a little different. Whether you're in North Alabama or down near where you are, Mike, in Florida, each property is going to be a little different with regard to when nutrition may be limiting, how it's managed, how much forest, how much crop, what crop is there, how much hay field, how much shrubland area, how old fields are managed, if they're grass dominated or not. There's all kinds of things that come into play that dictate when nutrition may be limiting on different properties. So you have to study your property, figure out what is limiting and when, and then that's when that's the best information to use with regard to what you should have in your food plots, if maximizing nutrition is your objective. If maximizing hunting is your objective, then I would look more strongly just to what do deer want to eat more than anything else during the time that I would be hunting. Mm-hmm. And then that's what I would plant in an area that, and in a food plot situation that is set up, designed to maximize your hunting success. Not necessarily a destination field, but a food plot that's designed for hunting.
Does focusing on, so I guess first of all, with Forbs, I'm assuming we're talking about hunting situations here. So I'm assuming those really would only come into play until maybe you start getting your frosts, and I assume that stuff would die off. Is focusing on Forbs like that a viable hunting strategy where you're like, oh, there's an area where I think they'll be feeding because of that?
During the bow season or early portion of the hunting season, if you're and of course it's different in Minnesota than in Florida because of the seasons and plant phenology and all. But if you're during the early portion of the hunting season, yes, there are opportunities for that. However, and I just wrote an article on this, I think that will go to Quality Whitetails, the magazine,
QDMA magazine,
QDMA, of course. Speaking to how fields managed in such a way can enable hunting success even after frost. So these fields may not have that much high quality forage in them after a couple of frosts, and most of the plants have died or gone into winter senescence, but the structure is still there. That's critical. If you have structure that is 4 to 5 feet tall, then deer will be moving around in that during the day, because if you're standing out in the middle of that structure, you may not be able to see 3 feet in any direction. So it's the same thing, essentially, with regard to visibility, as them being in a dense woody thicket that is further back in the woods that was, cut over 3 or 4 years ago. So if you're elevated in a stand and you can look down into these fields, these old fields or early successional areas, whatever you want to call them, and you have managed the field to promote plants that are, 4 to 6 feet tall, somewhere in that neighborhood, but certainly above about 4 feet, then you will see more deer activity in those fields during the daylight than any other type of field management that you could employ. That's a fact. Then, if you use your brain and think about, how can I manipulate this? And with regard to wind direction and getting in and out of stand sites, let's say, for example, you might have a cleared lane in that field, but you don't start that lane at the edge of the field, and have your stand right there. You want to let that, you don't want that lane to begin until on out into the field, maybe 30 or 50 yards. And especially for a rifle hunter, stretching that on out so the lane doesn't start until you get 50 yards out in the field, and then it might go 100 yards for up to a 150-yard shot or something like that. And it's only 1 tractor width wide. Mm-hmm. You keep this somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 to 12 feet wide, something like that, with regard to size of the disc or whatever you're using, or whether you might just want to spray it out and no-till topsoil, whatever the case may be. And then let's just say, for example, you go in there in August through early October, according to your latitude and when your correct planting time is, and you plant a very highly selected annual planting, something as simple as oats and crimson clover or Berseem clover, especially if you're down in Florida and Alabama where y'all are located and talking about throughout the Southeast, you're really not going to find anything that deer would rather eat during that time than oats, Berseem clover, crimson clover. And then you have amended the soil in your little lane out there, and then you have this neon green strip of forage out there in the middle of a field that's 4 to 6 feet tall that deer are bedding in, by the way, and then they stand up and they will go into this lane. The first thing they'll do is look left and right. They can't stand it. They want to know if anybody else is in this lane, eating or whatever. And then they're going to step out there and start feeding around a little bit. And that then allows you to view and judge the deer, decide if it's a deer that you want to shoot or not. And if it's not, you can get down out of your stand, once it starts to get dark, and the deer never see you, because the lane is not all the way to your stand. You could be wearing a blue leisure suit, as I've told some groups, flippantly, wearing Old Spice cologne if you're hunting it with the right wind, and they're not going to see you. You can get up and down out of your stand 3 or 4 times, and it doesn't matter if you have everything planned with your access and exit routes. So it adds a lot of joy. It's very fun to sit over some of these areas. Deer use them regularly throughout the fall and wintertime. And although most of the plants out there are brown and the stems may be dead, many of the plants that would be in these fields have what we call winter rosettes. It's green leaves that are produced in fall down at the base of the stems. This would be on many of the perennial plants. And deer will be selectively eating on those. So again, you have to get in there and look real closely. But in a dead field, what looks to be a dead field, you actually have more forage than you have in the woods. Now think about that. Now, of course, during a good acorn year, you could have of course, an excellent food source in the woods. But what about if you don't have that many oaks, or what about if you're in a year that's a poor acorn year? Never base your hunting or deer management, off of acorn crops. It's just a periodic bonus. Look instead at what is available in terms of forage throughout the year. And even in the fall and winter, you can have more food in these, quote, dead fields than you do in the woods.
Yeah, I love that. I love that idea you just brought up of creating that lane inside. I just automatically think of a Clearcut. I don't personally hunt on one, but I know a huge portion of our audience is in parts of the South where it's just big pine plantations where they're on probably a lease. So they're limited as to what spaces they can create, but a lot of times there'll be a Clearcut there. So you already told us one of the best places to hunt for daytime movement is going to be that Clearcut. And most of these places you can use Roundup in between rows of pines, or you could bush hog it and mow it and plant stuff. I think that's a really good idea for somebody on a lease, that kind of thing, to be able to double down on their clear areas.
That's absolutely true. And even if you're in a lease situation, if maybe at least sometimes they would let you mow between some of these pine rows, and plant something if you wanted to. If not, you should be able to take a backpack sprayer. And, until, of course, the pines get tall enough that they close their canopy after, several years. But especially, let's say years 1 to 4, somewhere in there, on most sites, you should be able to get in, and we routinely take backpack sprayers and spray out spots like this. And then many of these species, especially the clovers, you can no-till topsow and get a decent, if not excellent, stand of clover in some of those lanes if you wanted to have a planted strip.
Talking about a lot of this kind of stuff with the, like Mike mentioned, the clear cuts. That's something that's super big out here where I'm at in Alabama. Recently, I was in Tennessee last weekend, and then Kentucky the week before that. And these are like probably really my first experiences the last couple years of hunting in that kind of farmland type scenario. And they have, in a lot of these areas, they have these overgrown fields with a lot of like sycamore saplings and just grasses and stuff like that. And a lot of these forbs are in there. And what I've noticed is a lot of the deer activity, especially if you're sitting on a field edge, a lot of the deer activity is coming from those. And you're talking about bedding and a lot of that stuff within those overgrown areas. And that's something that I've found to be extremely true. Now, my question is, in a lot of these WMAs that I've been hunting on, you'll see it set up almost exactly what you said. There'll be strips of clover or something like that that's planted in the middle of these overgrown fields. So for the guys who are hunting in those type of areas, would you consider that to be one of those spots that would be set up for an early season or more of a late season type spot? Is that kind of what you're, I guess what I'm asking is where would you say that would be the most beneficial to hunt an area like that with the strip kind of in the middle of those overgrown fields?
Well, if you're talking about a planted strip, it could be any time during the season. Because
Okay.
you could plant something that is available from at least early September through winter.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. A lot of these places that I'm talking about are really, what I've noticed is a lot of the deer are using obviously the fields, the soybean fields, the fresh cut corn fields in the beginning of the season, and then later on in the season, it's just a little bit harder to try to figure out where to hunt at, because those, a lot of times they move away from that, they go to acorns or something like that, and so I'm really trying to figure out for me the best time to really start keying in on those areas. So
there's three things that I've heard. I've heard clear cut, I've heard soybean field, and I've heard old field. So there's three totally different vegetation types. Now, if you're talking about a soybean field, number one, is the soybean field a production field where they're going in and harvesting the beans, or is it a food plot? If it's a food plot, then that soybean field should be very attractive for deer throughout the hunting season, unless the deer eat the soybeans totally out. And if the deer eat the soybeans totally out, then either the population needs to be reduced and or additional habitat management needs to take place. If it's an old field, then that lane or strip that you have, it might be planted, as we just mentioned, or maybe not. See, if you're looking over one of these, quote, overgrown fields, you can see deer moving around in there, but it can be kind of tricky getting a shot.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you have a strip that is mowed, they're going to walk out into that strip or lane and look around and smell and pick around, even if you don't plant anything. So just having a strip out there, think of it as a shooting lane.
Mm-hmm.
That can help your hunting success right there. Now, with regard to a clear cut, and especially with regard to how old the clear cut is, if it's only 1 year old, one growing season after the stand has been cleared, there's going to be some cover out there, but the average cover might not be 4 or 5 feet tall. But after it's got 2 growing seasons on it, it's definitely going to be that tall, according to site prep treatment, whether they've used mechanical and or herbicide site prep with regard to planting additional pines. And then once the pines have been planted, then you're looking, usually somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 to 4 years when you can still see out over the area pretty good before it gets, really tall and where your visibility is very, very much blocked. And it's at that time that if you can take out a few of those seedling pine trees and leave for example, for 100 yards, take out 100 yards of them in one row, that can leave you a nice lane going out through that newly developing stand that can provide visibility. Does that answer what you were getting at?
Yeah, that's good. That's, I guess my question on a lot of that stuff is like, where is it beneficial? Because you go out there and you look at it, and if you look at it through the scope of I don't know anything about my plants, I don't know anything about Forbs, I don't know anything about any of this stuff, those don't look super attractive. But then when you look at it through everything that you just mentioned, it's like, oh, well, this is like a better food plot than something that I could plant, even, using these to the advantage.
Well, let me put it this way and see if this rings true. The plants that you're referring to in an old field area, no, they're not going to look attractive, especially after they have died or gone into senescence. I mean, they're the stems above ground are dead, and that's not going to look attractive at all. But again, you're not managing nutritionally for those plants at that time. You're managing for them so deer can have optimal nutrition during spring and summer. That's when those plants are fresh and really growing, and the deer are strongly selecting those. And if you don't have a good nutritional plane for the does, that makes a big impact on the fawns in terms of their survival. Because if the does are not able to produce enough milk, the fawns are weaker and more susceptible to predation. Many of them, in those cases, starve. And even when you see some of these pictures of coyotes carrying deer, not all of those did coyotes chase down and kill. Many of those fawns were dead on the ground, and the coyotes have scavenged them. That's something that we've documented. So I'm not saying that most of the fawns that coyotes eat were scavenged, but make no mistake, many of them are. Many of them are scavenged. So providing that nutrition to the does is important for fawns and fawn survival, which, by the way, shouldn't be that big of an issue if you've got so many deer that they're eating your soybean food plots to the ground. You see what I'm saying? I mean, if that's the case, then, fawn predation, coyote predation on your fawn shouldn't be a big issue.
Yeah.
But also for bucks growing antlers. So if the bucks on your property are trying to grow antlers on a nutritional plane where crude protein on average is about 12%, don't expect average antler growth per age class to be as good as if the average crude protein content was above 16 or 17%, for example. So that's where those Forbs can make a huge difference with regard to the average protein content in the mixed diet of the bucks. And think about when bucks are growing antlers. You got to have that maximum nutrition and maximum tonnage. If they're going to eat, 3 to 5% of their body weight a day, they need maximum tonnage of the best foods they can get, if you're trying to maximize things, from April through at least early, let's say perhaps mid-July. But April, May, June, those are the critical months for antler production. And deer are not eating acorns then. And even if they were, they wouldn't be growing much of an antler because acorns are only about 5% crude protein. So for maximum antler growth, bucks are needing about 16% protein in their mixed diet.
So that basically what you're saying is, I mean, you see that true in areas like where I hunt around northern Alabama, where those big woods areas where it's a lot of acorns, especially this time of year, but you don't quite see the antler growth of somewhere like Tennessee or Kentucky.
That makes perfect sense to me.
In some areas of Tennessee, it wouldn't be so good. You can go up on the Cumberland Plateau, and the average 3-year-old buck has an antler score of 100 inches. If you go to southwest Tennessee and some areas along the Tennessee River where you have more open ground and there's more agriculture, thus there is better food, then the average score of a 3-year-old buck there is going to be anywhere from about 115 to 125 inches. For example, at Ames Plantation, the average 3-year-old buck scores 123 inches. That's not the average hunter-killed buck. That's the average 3-year-old buck, period. And so that's 23 inches greater than on the Cumberland Plateau.
Yeah.
Where it's mostly forested, a lot of closed canopy forest. And so that's directly attributed to food availability, not the quality of the soil. Ragweed growing in the Mississippi alluvial plain has the same amount of nutrition as ragweed growing in the middle of the Chattahoochee National Forest, if you can find one. It's going to be difficult to find one because it's all, forest or 99% forest. So you can go into these very poor soil areas and pick particular plants, send them into the lab, and the nutritional content of those plants are the same as those same plants grown on very high quality soils. The difference is the amount of production. On a high quality soil, you get a lot more biomass produced than you would of a particular plant in a low quality soil. Think about a crop producer. A soybean producer does not fertilize his soybeans so that they are richer. They fertilize soybeans so they produce more yield, get greater soybean yield, for financial reasons. But the quality of the soybean leaves and the quality of the soybean seed is the same if the soybean is grown on poor quality soil as if it were grown on a high quality soil.
Okay, yeah. So you just said something that's like a little bit almost like counter. I've heard so many times of two things, and I'm sure if you've heard both of these things. But I've heard one, food plots or food sources that deer will congregate to specific areas because the food quality is better there, number one. And then number two is I've heard a lot of people recommend if you have a good oak tree that you should be fertilizing that oak tree because the deer will prefer those acorns over another oak tree. Can you address both those things?
That's false.
Yeah. That's what I was picking up from what you were saying.
Wrong, Mike. You are wrong.
That's it.
And I'm not saying that flippantly. I mean, we have collected all kinds of data through the years. We just published a paper from a 10-year study looking at the effect of fertilization on oaks and acorn production and acorn quality. Fertilization had no effect whatsoever. Thinning the stand and enabling the crowns of individual trees to have more sunlight did have an effect. With regard to plants in one section of a field being more nutritious than plants and the same plants being more nutritious in another section of the field, no, unless soil nutrients in some section is so low that the plant cannot grow there. And if the plant can't grow there, then you'll see, like yellowing of the leaves and that kind of thing. Or some sections of a field may be waterlogged. And if that's the case, then the quality of those plants are going to be lower. And oftentimes in that situation, you'll see like a purplish coloration to the leaves and also yellowing of the leaves. So in those situations, yes, but notwithstanding those extreme conditions, no, you're not going to see soybean plants here more nutritious than soybean plants, 100 yards over there, or ragweed, or daisy fleabane, or greenbrier, or strawberry bush, or pick one.
Yeah. All right. So I could tell already. I've got way more questions than time, so I'm going to try to be smart here. But okay, let's go back to this Forbs thing a little bit. For somebody that has either it's a lease and maybe there's some, and let's call it what's the difference? Let's call it a clear cut area or a regrowth type area. What is that? What would you call that, Dr. Harper? It's not an old field because it's new.
If you had a stand of pines,
yep,
and the pines are all harvested, that's a clear cut.
Yep.
That's a silvicultural clear cut. And then what's going to happen is the seed bank is going to respond, and that first growing season after the trees are removed, you're going to have, most often an explosion of growth, except when they place specific herbicides on the site as a site preparation, what we call a site prep for planting additional pines the following year. And so in that case, you won't see as much growth because they're trying to control the competition for the new pine seedlings. So that would simply be a clear cut. And in the first 2 to 3 years after a clear cut, and even after the pine seedlings have been planted, you're going to see an explosion of early successional plants growing on that site. And those plants can be highly nutritious depending on which plants they are, and they can provide outstanding structure or cover for deer depending on which they are, because some only grow, a few inches tall, and some of them will grow 5 or 6 feet tall or even taller. So let's say, for example, dog fennel. That's something that you would have in virtually every pine stand that's clear cut throughout the South.
Mm-hmm.
Well, deer will nip on dog fennel a little bit, but it's a low selectivity by deer. But the cover provided by dog fennel through the summer and even into fall is very good. It blocks visibility. Deer feel safe hanging out in an area where the plant growth is anywhere from 5 to 6 feet tall, as we talked about. So the structure is good. I don't manage a site with regard to removing and retaining certain plants just on food quality. You also have to consider the cover quality as well. So a pine stand that has been harvested, that's a clear cut. Now, what's the second?
Okay, so along with that, a lot of times I see like a logging ramp. So maybe it's not completely clear, or let's say an old logging ramp. So let's say it's been around 15 years. It's an area that's cleared out, but there's not a food plot planted there. There's not tall trees growing in it. So like let's say a 2 or 3 acre opening on a piece of property. What are some techniques somebody can use to manage that the best, as far as like creating that into an area that would be good, not only as a food source, but specifically as to be able to hunt over as well?
Yeah. Well, it could be planted if you choose to have a food plot there. That's an obvious option.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you choose not to, then you could manipulate the naturally occurring plants by simply killing the ones that you don't want and allowing the ones that you do want to grow. And the easiest way to do that, especially on relatively small fields, is with a backpack sprayer with some glyphosate in there.
Yeah.
And just go along and spot spray those plants you don't want, leave the ones that you do want. Now, if you're starting to get into a larger field, you can do the same thing on an ATV or on an open cab tractor. And we do this regularly. And before people just roll their eyes back and say, man, he is totally off his rocker, think about this. How would you otherwise manage any field to prevent it from growing into woods in the eastern U.S. where we get 30-plus inches of rain a year?
Yeah.
You are going to have to either use mechanical methods such as mowing or disking, chemical methods with herbicides, or fire. You're going to have to disturb the site, or eventually in the next 6 to 8 years, it's going to grow up into woods. We all know that. And so let's say, for example, you're going to mow. All right, so you put, a rotary mower, what we call a bush hog, on the back of a tractor, and then you proceed to drive over every square foot of that field, don't you? And
Yep.
you mow down all of the vegetation. Well, what if you didn't put a mower on the back of it, but instead you hooked up your sprayer, but you left the booms of your sprayer closed? You don't open them up. You don't want a broadcast application unless the field is covered. Let's say, for example, you got a Bermuda grass field that you're wanting to improve for deer. Well, yeah, I'm going to put the booms out, and I'm going to broadcast spray that Bermuda grass field with about 48 ounces of arsenal per acre, and I'm going to kill it. And then I'm going to come back in with about a 5% solution of glyphosate later in the summer, and I'm going to spot spray areas that were either missed or areas that have come back up. All right, but now let's go back to the other situation with the old field where you've mowed it, but now instead of mowing, you're putting a sprayer on and you're leaving your booms folded up. Now I've got a spray gun, and I'm driving across the field in the same pattern that I would if I were mowing the field, but I'm not covering every square foot. I'm skipping about 5 to 10 rows. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I'm going that I'm usually in low range in first or second gear, and I'm steering with my left hand, and I got a spray gun in my right hand, and I'm just rolling along. And when I see things I don't like, I kill it. And we're doing this, for example, in June. June and July is a perfect time to do this once per year. And so I'm coming back in the next strip about 5 tractor widths over. And so coming back through there on either side, I'm just killing things I don't want. Now, when I spray those things I don't want, of course, some of that might splash onto a few things that's growing right there that I do want. That's okay. Don't worry about it. It's just a dead patch. And by the time it rains again, at least the second rain, what's going to happen to that dead area?
Of the seed bank, that something's going to grow up.
Something's going to respond, right? And if something responds that I like, hallelujah. If something responds that I don't like, what am I going to do next year?
Spray it again.
I'm going to kill it. That's right. And so once you do that about 3 years in a row, it just so happens it's like, wow, almost all of this stuff out here now is good because I've killed what wasn't good. Now, the limitation there is a couple of things. Number one, people recognizing that these woolly, weedy-looking plants are actually good, because especially of those of us who grew up, on farms and rural areas, and our family's been there a long time. Our grandpas and daddies and uncles and what, they taught us those plants were bad. They did everything under the sun to get rid of them everywhere, clean fields and fence rows and whatnot. But that's not true with regard to wildlife. It's just not true. If it were true, then we wouldn't have any, because our wildlife, our native wildlife, has evolved over thousands of years with the plants that are native and naturally occurring to our areas, okay? But there happens to be some that deer don't like as good as others. So we're killing those, and we're letting the others fill in. Now, where I spray those patches, what generally comes up from dead areas like that, because I sprayed it, those plants now are dead. And those plants coming in from the seed bank, germinating from seed, most of them are annuals. Over the course of 2 or 3 years, the remaining plants are going to be perennials. And so I have patches of annual plants coming in a matrix or across, a broader area of plants that are dominated by perennials. I also am going to have, brambles and some shrubs and small trees, whether it be persimmon or elm or cherry or eastern red cedar, Virginia pine, wherever you are, you're going to have little trees coming in. Well, if you don't like those trees, kill them. You're sitting there on a ATV or on a open cab tractor, just spray the leaves. That's all you got to do, and it's dead. And so then you've got this heterogeneous structure, and deer absolutely love that. You've got annual plants, you've got perennial herbaceous plants, you've got some shrubby stuff coming in. So now your whole focus and picture of managing an early successional community or your old field is totally different. You have food plants that are mixed in with cover plants. Deer are hanging around this area every day, 12 months out of the year. And then you can manipulate little things like lanes going through the field that you might or you might not plant, fire breaks where you might burn sections of the field. After you burn, you might lightly disc through some areas to stimulate more annual plants throughout. I mean, there's a whole wide range of things that you can do to manipulate your old fields differently. But first is getting rid of the perennial cool season grass, getting rid of the Bermuda grass, the Bahia grass, the tall fescue, the orchard grass, and smooth brome. You know, if you're up in the Midwest, get rid of those non-native perennial grasses. And if you do so by default, I challenge anybody to identify one management technique that can enhance nutritional carrying capacity or the cover value of a site greater than that. You will do more with one single spraying of getting rid of the perennial cool season grasses for deer than any other single management technique you can do. That's a fact.
Wow.
And then you just start managing the naturally occurring plants and guiding it in the direction that you want it to go. You have lots of options, and it's very attractive for deer.
I feel like you just answered a huge question. I always never, like, should I bush hog or should I think burning is probably, based on the research I've heard lately, is burning's always kind of the best option. But yeah, like what you just said, it sounds like if you have a choice over, you got one tool, you're going to use some herbicide over just bush hog in a field.
There's probably no situation in the last 20 years in which I would use a bush hog to manage a field for deer. Yeah. My gosh, even if I can't burn, I'm going to put, if nothing else, I'm going to hook up a disc. And maybe the growth is too great on the field to disc. Well, at least I'm going to bush hog at first and then disc to again stimulate more annual plants instead of just having a solid perennial plant community, and especially with the guys and gals up in the Northeast that are trying to manage for early successional areas. They have a problem with goldenrod, for example, just taking over the site. Well, if you just mow fields once a year, it's either going to be taken over by something like goldenrod or some kind of perennial grass. And so by spraying the grass, or you could spray the goldenrod or just discing, you're going to disrupt the root systems of the goldenrod, and you're going to stimulate a bunch of annual plants, which on average are going to be of better value than just having the goldenrod. Although, you know, there's more than 100 species of goldenrods. Some of them are strongly selected by deer. Most of them are kind of medium, and the goldenrod that's probably most prevalent is Canada goldenrod, and it's on down on the medium-ish. Deer will nibble on it a little bit, but not strongly. I love it for the structure, but I don't want a field of solid goldenrod.
Yeah, so kind of just, I feel like we talked a long time about Forbs and stuff like that, and I know there's so much more in that, but I think one of the things that I struggle with, and probably the majority of guys who consider themselves to be deer hunters struggle with as well, is a lot of the identifying of these plants and things like that you're talking about. What's a good resource that you would I say this knowing what the answer is going to be, but what's a good resource that you would give people for learning to identify some of the things that you're talking about?
Yeah, well, it just so happens to be.
I was trying to let you just really push something really easily right here.
Let me tell you something, guys. I'm a wildlife biologist and a manager at heart, and I'll tell you something, I'm not a business person, and I darn sure am not a salesman. And it is with much hesitancy for me to try to promote something that may be for sale with my name on it. But I'll put it this way. Yes, I revised a book that I wrote, and it's out again now, and it's Wildlife Food Plots and Early Successional Plants. And I wrote this because there's so many people asking these questions. And also, I wrote this somewhat selfishly to also help myself, because if you don't have some kind of reference to help you, you can't remember everything. There's no way. Nobody can remember everything, and certainly not me. And so it helps for me to be able to go back through and refresh myself on some things every once in a while. And so I thought, I want a guide that, of course, covers all this food plot stuff, but also includes pictures and information on plants that I see coming up in my food plots and in these early successional and old field areas that I want to be able to refresh myself and remember, what are these plants and what is their value to wildlife? If it's good, what is it? Is it food? Is it cover? If it's not, then how do I get rid of it? And that is the big key part that is lacking in all the other plant ID guides. And I'm not promoting this as a plant ID guide. There is a plant ID guide in the back of the book, and it covers more than 300 commonly occurring early successional plants. But I'm not a botanist. I'm a wildlife biologist that I like to say with a working knowledge of plants, and I have as the best pictures that I could take or find of various plants that I commonly see, and that I commonly see from Michigan to Alabama and at least North Florida. So if you're anywhere between there, from eastern Kansas to the Carolinas, these plants are going to be on your property. I see them commonly no matter where I go. And so there's information in there on how to identify them, multiple color pictures of each of them. I like color pictures. I'm not going through the dichotomous keys anymore. I'm out of graduate school, and I don't do that anymore. And again, I'm not a botanist. I like to use terms that quote regular people can understand, and then provide information whether this is a good food plant or good cover plant, and if not, how do I get rid of it? If it's with an herbicide, which herbicide? Maybe it's by mowing at a certain time of year, or maybe it's by disking, but at least to provide information on how you can manage either for or against this plant. So that's what I've tried to include in there.
That's excellent.
Where is the best place to buy that? Because I'm looking, CraigHarper.net is this really jacked up guy from Australia. I guess he's a motivational speaker. Where do we find your books?
The website for the book is
put you on the spot.
Hey guys, can you hear me?
Yes. Yep.
Okay, I think I lost you there for a second. Oh. What did you ask?
Yeah.
Where do
we buy the book?
I'm sorry.
Nope, I didn't. You cut out. I thought you were having to Google it.
No. The website for the book is noxopublishing.com. NOCSO publishing.com.
Okay. I'll put a link to that in the show notes, but
okay.
NOCSO.
NOCSO publishing.com.
Got it. Okay, cool. Yeah, I'll put a link in the notes, but great. Parker, did you have anything else? I know you might have to drop off on us to take care of some daddy duties.
Yeah, no, man. I really enjoyed that. That was a lot of the. I know y'all are going to keep going. I can't wait to listen to the rest of it. But man, that's some good stuff that I had no idea of on most of it. So.
Well, there's lots of things that we didn't cover, especially with regard to management. How, when to burn, when to add disking and spot spray applications in relation to fire. You just can't cover all this in an hour's time, but
sure.
Maybe on some additional call we can cover some of those things.
I just had one last topic that I wanted to cover here, and I know you could speak very well to this. You've got books on this as well. Could you kind of cover the successional stages with plant growth? And I know this is going to be like kind of a quick overview, but really just focus on how we as hunters should relate to that. So what if we're, let's say we're going to a national forest, so I cannot control where these stages are, but what are the stages I'll see out there, and what should I be looking for as a hunter as far as how to relate to that, where to hunt?
Well, I'm not necessarily hunting or recommending people to hunt in relation to various successional stages. You would want to do that, of course, based on where deer are occurring, and that is influenced more than anything by the structure of the cover provided and by food availability. Now, that's through most of the fall, winter, and of course, the rut is a strong influence on how, when, where you hunt. But with regard to the plant communities, just think about the cover and the structure that is available where deer are going to be spending most of their time, and then the quality and amounts of food. And high quality food can be provided in the woods, which would be a late successional stage. So it's according to your management, and obviously you can't manage anything on a national forest. Only the U.S. Forest Service or State Wildlife Agency would be doing that. But on your own properties, I'll just quickly cover the successional stages as you asked. If you go out into a field and you disc that field up like you were going to plant with conventional techniques, and you let that field sit through the growing season, you're going to have all kinds of plants coming in, but the majority of them are going to be annual plants, as we described earlier, those that grow, produce seed, and then die and have to come back from seed. Well, after 2 to 3 years, that plant community is going to change. Without anything else being done, it's going to change within 2 to 3 years. It happens quickly initially. And by year 3, that field is going to be dominated by perennial plants. The annual plants are going to fade in occurrence. And so at that time, the whole community of the field has changed, and we call that the second successional stage. You have moved from an annual plant community to a perennial plant community. And there may be lots of different vegetation types that would represent either your annual or perennial plant community. For example, Bermuda grass is a perennial grass. It has very low structure, but that would be representative of a second successional stage. Now, you might have a field dominated by broom sedge or little blue stem, and I'm just giving some common grasses here that people can understand. Those both would be native warm season grasses. Well, their growth structure is totally different. They're going to be much taller than the Bermuda grass. And then you could have switchgrass or big blue stem, for example, that are even taller. But all of those are perennial grasses, but the structure is very, very different. All right, on the sites where you have perennial plants, if nothing is done over time, and this usually occurs somewhere within the 3rd to the 5th year, you're going to see a lot of woody plants coming in, tree seedlings, and most of these are from light-winged seeded species such as pines or elm or maple or box elder, lots of different tree species. 1, that require full sunlight. 2, that are relatively fast growing. And if left alone, those trees will overtake the site, and that first woody dominated plant community is what we call the 3rd successional stage. Now, that might be a field dominated by eastern red cedar or Virginia pine, for example. And if you're on up north, it might be aspen. But over time, and now it takes more time, you might be getting into 40, 50, 60 years before those species, those tree species, start to thin out and other tree species take their place. Now, in the eastern U.S. and throughout a majority of the southeast, you're talking about the oaks, hickories, sourwood, red maple, black gum, etc. Those are going to eventually take over that stand naturally. And when that happens, that would be what we call the fourth successional stage. And then on some sites, not all sites, but on some sites, you may have those species which may grow in the shade. So whether it be white pine, sugar maple, eastern hemlock, American beech, there are several species that can grow in the presence of shade, and now literally over the course of 100 to 200 years without disturbance, those tree species may overtake the current forest stand, and that then would be representative of a fifth successional stage coming in. So to keep it easy, we think of herbaceous plant communities of those annual and perennial herbaceous species as the early successional communities, and then when woody species begin to dominate, we call that a mid-successional stage. And then once you have a forest, especially of those later and more long-lived species, we're talking about a late successional stage. Does that make sense? Is that kind of easy to understand?
Yes, and I'll tell you where I kind of wanted to ask you about that is I just think of when I'm scouting out an area I haven't been to a lot of times, I'll jump on Google Maps, and Google gives you the ability to jump back in time, and some of these maps might go back 50 years. So just hearing you explain that got me thinking, okay, I know what these stages are. So if I see an area was clear cut 3 to 5 years ago, then hearing you discuss that, I have a better idea of what to expect. That's probably going to be like a good blend of food and cover. And maybe once you get into that third stage, maybe there's not quite as much food because it's more woody growth, but that might be real good.
That's exactly right, because it's being shaded out. And when that happens, on average, and there's a number of data sets from very different places throughout the eastern U.S., but all of those converge in that 6 to 8 year time period. And so by 6 to 8 years without disturbance, you're going to have sufficient tree growth to shade out a majority of the herbaceous plants that would be growing underneath. And so with regard to management in a vast majority of circumstances, you're looking at having to implement some kind of disturbance within a 6 to 8 year period, especially if you're trying to perpetuate an early successional community. Now, don't confuse an early successional community with an understory under a forest, the ground cover that would occur under a forest. Now, that would be a late successional stage. You're in a forest. But especially with a little sunlight added, you will have what we call an understory growing. On a majority of sites, this is going to be dominated by woody species, small trees and vines, and many of the small trees kind of stunted in growth because, just kind of hanging on. They got just enough sunlight to kind of hang on and waiting for, a gap for them to try and grow up through, and they will eventually die over time. And then as trees produce seed, more little seedlings will come up, and they kind of hang on there. So most of the understory in a majority of these areas will be woody dominated, with less than 20% of the plants being herbaceous. But there's also shade tolerant herbaceous plants, and you can have an understory on some sites, particularly relatively moist sites, where you can have 100% coverage of an understory and 50% or more of that being herbaceous plants. But that's a forest understory. That's not an early successional community. There's a very real distinction there. These early successional communities are dominated by sun-loving, shade-intolerant plants.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then I think of like the fourth stage is where you might start getting into your mass crops, like acorns and that kind of stuff. Is that about right time-wise?
Sure. In a forest setting, most of the oak trees are not going to begin producing acorns until, close to 40 years. Now, if oaks are in an open area and they're getting full sunlight, and this is not only true of sawtooth oak, for example, which is a non-native oak that is commonly planted in fields, but you might plant a white oak in an open situation where that tree is getting full sunlight. You will see those trees produce acorns within about 6 to 10 years. So that's pretty common to see that. So all oak trees don't just start producing acorns at 40 years of age. It's according to the site that they're growing in, how much sunlight they're getting, well, that's just it. Where they're growing, how much competition they have that they're trying to reach up and get as much sunlight as possible and keep growing. In those tight forested situations in a developing stand, it's not until 35 to 40 years usually before you start seeing acorn production in most oaks.
Okay. There's one last tree I wanted to ask about, something I've have not had a lot of success finding and hunting over, but I know in the South here, you hear the guys from Primos in Mississippi, their August strategies are almost exclusively this, but they focus a lot on persimmons. And I think you mentioned that they're one of the first woody species to kind of grow up in an area. How mature does a persimmon tree typically need to be before it can start producing?
Persimmons are a tree that you would see in these early successional areas, not because it has a light winged seed, but because the seed is eaten by so many mammals, and then the mammals, defecate and drop them out in the field, and you'll see the persimmon seedlings popping up as a result. Mm-hmm. And you will commonly see persimmons starting to produce fruit within 10 to 12 years, sometimes sooner. But keep in mind, if the trees you're looking at are not producing fruit, they may be males. Mm-hmm. Because that's one of those tree species where you have trees with male flowers and other trees with female flowers, whereas some species have both male and female flowers on the same tree. And so just because that persimmon is not producing fruit doesn't mean that it's a bad producer. It's probably a male, and of course you need the males to pollinate the female flowers so you can have the fruits.
That's one of those where I'll find, I feel like the leaves are pretty easily to recognize with the spotted, with the black spots on them. I'll find juvenile trees frequently, but a lot of times I'm hunting areas where I'm never able to find a mature tree. Those, I guess there's different species of them probably, but they typically grow in like wetter areas and they need open sunlight. Is that right?
Are you talking about persimmons?
Yes.
No, they're not different species.
Okay.
All of the persimmons are the same species.
Okay.
The wild persimmon that you see.
Yes.
Outgrowing and occurring naturally. No, you can see persimmons very regularly on relatively dry and low productivity soils. They will do very well there. You also may see them in moist areas, but it's a tree that can occur on a variety of sites.
Okay. You just got to scout and find them, I guess. All right. Well, I think that wraps up most of my questions for now. Like I said, like we talked about earlier, I think we probably could talk like this for 3-4 hours, but we'll keep it to a digestible form, and we'll just have to have you back on if you're willing. Well,
very good. Enjoyed it, and hopefully we covered something that a few people might find informative and interesting, and I hope your season goes well.
I think so. Speaking of seasons, I kind of waited to the end to spring this on you, but football season's not going so well, huh?
Well, if you graduated from Clemson, it's still going quite well. We didn't perform quite as well Saturday against Carolina, but a win is a win. But Obviously I'm a Tennessee fan, but it's only going to get better.
Yeah, I'm a Florida State fan myself,
it's only going to get better.
Not a whole lot of smack talking coming out of me right now either. So, but yeah, and I guess I'd have one. I wanted to ask you at the beginning, and we jumped into it, and I couldn't help but just keep asking deer or habitat type questions. Did you get to hunt the early season in Tennessee there at all?
No, I didn't. I'm still doing way too much work trying to get burns in and doing a lot of other activity, but I don't usually start deer hunting until the weather cools off a bit.
Yeah. How do you? What type of property do you hunt yourself? Do you? Obviously you're on land all the time, but you don't have access to hunt whatever you want. Where do you hunt yourself?
Well, I have been very fortunate to be able to hunt lots of states, and so there's all kinds of property that I hunt on, from the Piedmont area to coastal plains, mountains, Midwest, Northeast, way down in the deep South. So I've been very fortunate in being able to work with and have relationships with people that enable me to hunt on a variety of properties. So
you just basically hunt on friends' properties that you work with or whoever, that type of thing. Is you just don't have like this year I'm this is the one piece. It's you kind of work your way around and see a lot of different areas, huh?
There's a couple of properties in Tennessee that I hunt regularly, but I travel so much, I don't get to hunt any one property kind of exclusively through the season. No, I haven't done that in a long, long time.
Do you do consulting like as your own business besides working for the University of Tennessee?
I do some consulting, but of course all of that is outside Tennessee. It would be illegal for me to consult inside Tennessee because it is our job as extension specialists to provide management information for our citizens in Tennessee.
Cool. Well, that's a pretty good asset for the state of Tennessee then. Well, thank you so much again, Dr. Harper. I really appreciate you coming on. I really enjoyed it. I learned a lot. I'm sure our listeners are. Parker?
Yeah, it was great. That was awesome. It was great getting to talk to you, and I look forward to doing it again in the future.
Well, thank you, guys. Talk to you later.
Yeah, good luck the rest of the season.